we are recording.
Excellent. We are working through this book, Mapping Apologetics, and we've done a series of sessions, unrecorded, that we just want to reference. So there's some continuity between the first video and this video. Um, So in the last video we were talking about sort of like the history of apologetics in the Bible, but also the history of apologetics, and then following the outline of the book, we start to get into different methodologies. So the first methodology that was addressed was presuppositionalism, um, which had two key thinkers until the originator of it, or I would guess he would say that God was the originator of it, but presuppositionalism, and then also a pupil of his by the name of John Frame. Uh, they are mostly similar with some exceptions. Um, and the similarity would be the notion of a presupposition, which is basically the idea that the belief in the Christian God um, is um, not something that is argued in a classical sense. So the way that philosophy normally functions, where you ultimately develop premises that support a particular type of conclusion that all parties, all rational parties, can agree to. That is to say, analyzing the premises and looking for validity, so on and so forth. That approach is a flawed ultimately, because essentially the truth that God exists does not need to be proven in sort of that classical or direct way.
Hmm.
That the argument for God, according to presuppositionalism, is an indirect argument, um, that we are made in the image of God, that um, that I guess sort of the biggest criticism of the classical apologetics would be that um, the human is putting God on trial, as it were, by utilizing sort of arguments and analyzing the arguments, whereas the creature needs to understand its relationship to the creator, and that is a subordinate relationship.
Hmm.
So any all and that basically covers all classical apologetics. Um, that there's a problem. That's a fundamental problem. The other fundamental problem, as the presuppositionalists see it, is that once the Holy Spirit witnesses, as it were, to the individual and regenerates them to accept belief, that there is a chasm between believers and non-believers. That chasm is so deep in terms of our fallenness, in terms of the Holy Spirit regenerating some, but not regenerating others, that there is no point of contact for a discussion. Um, and and Trish and I had been talking about, like, at some level that seems like absurd, but but to play the presuppositionalist position, um, at least makes sense within their position. That is to say that uh, the worldviews or the views or perspectives are so drastically different that you can't even start the conversation. So for Cornelius Van Til, primarily the function of apologetics then is more claiming the gospel and praying that the Holy Spirit will work in that individual, as opposed to members coming to the table and hashing out the argument according to the rules of logic and
Hmm.
etc. So he's pretty extreme on that. John Frame, you want to take up Frame?
Sure. I think like one of the primary differences between Frame and Van Til was their concept of common ground.
Mm-hmm.
Because Frame, so Van Til thought that there was no common ground between the believer and the non-believer,
Right.
but Frame found or believed that there was common ground between the believer and non-believer.
Correct.
Um, that was the main. That was the main difference. I feel like there was one other thing on like how they perceived truth. Is that right?
Yeah.
What was that one?
Um, that I'm not grabbing.
Okay.
It's not
Um,
coming.
and then just something else about presuppositionalism was because the argument for God is indirect, it
Mhm.
usually ends up being a circular argument. And
Correct.
for I don't know exactly the reasoning behind this, but presuppositionalists are okay with circular arguments as long as the circle is large enough, essentially. So you're not just going from one premise back to the other or a couple hops, but it takes a lot of hops. And I think one of the reasons was because there's like a coherentist aspect to it, where
Yeah.
because all of these things are interconnected, they support that indirect argument. Um, and yeah, one of the things that Van Til, and I think both Van Til and Frame took up was with that. Coherentist isn't the right word. What was it? Where they basically believed that you kind of had to analyze a system as a whole. Um, so
Yeah.
you couldn't take it apart. Like you couldn't analyze a tree without the world that supports it,
Or
right?
yes. Yeah. It was. I think it was. I think possibly the word was a web.
Yeah, a web of connections.
All of these things are sort of like interconnected,
hmm
right? Which
Yeah.
actually, in a sense, comes up with our reading today a little bit. A little bit.
hmm
That even though the worldviews from the believer to the non, unbeliever are vastly different, we could still use sort of science to understand how trees grow, etc.
Right. I
But
think there's a difference though.
but the metaphysic
hmm
behind it is really what's different, and
Mm-hmm.
therefore the believer or the Christian will ultimately point to the origin of the tree,
Right.
which will ultimately be God and other theological elements surrounding that, right?
Right.
Like provision, providing for creation, providing for humans, so on and so forth. Um, so yeah, that you're right, and I think also you've got the other distinction between Frame and Van Til is this direct versus indirect. So the Van Til was only interested in the indirect arguments,
Mm-hmm. Oh, right.
whereas Frame was open to the direct arguments, and also he was open to an arsenal of arguments,
Mm-hmm.
understanding that even though inductive reasoning leads only to probability, that it's still useful
Mm-hmm.
in terms of uh, bringing the believer or the arguer to see some truth,
Right.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Almost sort of like it's like a gateway, even if it's not the final determining argument.
Mm-hmm.
So open to inductive reasoning, whereas Van Til is very much against inductive reasoning because it only leads to probability, and according to his method, he is seeking certainty, um, and yeah, and then open to direct arguments, direct and indirect arguments, not only indirect.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So far more open to that. The Do we move on?
I think one of the other things that we
Oh
talked
yeah,
about
sure.
was one of the things that we were what's the right word? Uh, One of the things that didn't align well with us with presuppositionalism is like, why can't you have the presuppositionalist point of view from any worldview, and take that presupposition and then suss out the worldview. You could theoretically pick any one that works, and then
Exactly.
there's no problem.
Exactly. That seems to be one of the greatest flaws,
Yep.
or as well. That if you're going to make this move and argue that it is just presupposed as truth,
hmm
why does it have to be the Reformed Christian version? Why couldn't it be any of the world religions plugged into that?
Yeah. hmm
It, um,
That was another thing too that Van Til did was he kind of boiled it down to you're not picking. a worldview. It's the believer versus the non-believer. It lumps all other categories into a single one. So for him, it was just a there was only truth and untruth, right? It was only
Yes,
believer and non-believer.
entire binary.
Yeah. So, which I mean, I suppose you could have the same point of view from Judaism or pick any other religion, or maybe
Totally.
there are situations where your presupposition doesn't account for a binary and it allows for
Right.
more. But yeah.
Right. I think you're absolutely right. But yeah, most of the world religions, if you have in all of the world religions, you're going to have a spectrum,
Hmm.
and you'll have the spectrum all the way from traditionalists and conservatives, um, moderates, and then sort of liberals, as it were.
Hmm.
That maybe not they more practice, but they don't actually believe in these metaphysical truths, right? But everyone's going. You're always going to have, at least within the conservative traditionalist bunch, ones that hold to this is true.
Hmm. Yeah.
Uh, and well, I mean, yeah, I'll be hard. This is true, and the other ones are false.
Hmm.
Everyone else is misled. So you have that problem. If you can presuppose, why can't I presuppose?
Hmm.
And why can't I presuppose my religion? And and that seems to lead to a reductio ad absurdum.
Hmm.
It makes no sense that
Yeah.
anyone can plug anything into their own presupposition.
I guess it kind of makes sense why you might see that there could be no common ground from a presuppositionalist point of view because of that
Mhm.
disconnect. It's like, oh, well, I'm presupposing my worldview and you're presupposing yours, so I guess we can't
Yeah,
agree,
yeah,
on a
it
lot of
almost
things.
seems like it would be a similar problem to the fideist as well, right?
Mm,
I just believe on this, or I just have faith that this is true, and someone else comes up and I just have faith that this is true, and then the onlooker is looking at it and it seems like, well, see, I mean, there's no way, there's no your basis is faith, and there's no ultimate way to determine which is true or not, given the narrowness of your methodology.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I think
So
so. Alvin Plantinga was the next one that
Alvin
was
Plantinga is
mentioned,
the next one,
and he kind of
under this heading of reformed epistemology.
right. And
We're
he
going
kind of tried to resolve some of the issues. I would say it's kind of, from my point of view, it's an improvement upon presuppositionalism. From that, he kind of resolves some of the issues that come with the presupposing part,
right.
where he says that we essentially have an awareness of God, which what sensus
The sensus divinitatis,
divinitatus, yeah.
yeah, the sense of the divine.
That is something that is just like a sense that we have. Like we perceive vision and touch and sound and taste and all those things. It's just some other sense that we have, and
Mhm.
so we don't. Um, in that sense, we can use it. We can use the sense of the divine as a point of argument. Um, from that point, you have to go from the sense of the divine to a Christian God, I believe. It's not apparent that the sense of the divine immediately evokes the Christian God,
Right.
but it is there. And then he also went that the sense that it is the Christian God is that a person individually has Christian faith is a gift from God, and so they're
Right.
able to make that connection. Like that, making that connection is the gift, I suppose,
Right. Right.
um, which is an
Yeah, I
interesting
think
concept.
just to add to what you were
Hmm.
saying, the our very constitution as creatures, um, made by this creator, is such that we're we're crafted in such a way, we're made in such a way to, like, imago Dei kind of thing, to have to have it's not an innate idea, but it's almost sort of like, um, there's something innate in us that gets triggered when we experience reality and when we have moments of awe that ultimately point to a sense of the divine,
Hmm.
right? And I would say too, I mean, I know that this wasn't really added, but I would say too that you could do a sort of almost an argument by accumulation by looking at all of the in the ancient world, all of these different world religions coming up with the notion of the divine.
Hmm.
It's an odd. I actually think it's very odd or curious how it is the case that all of these various human groups that had no connection, and there's vast land masses between them or water, no communication to share the idea early on,
Mm-hmm.
anyway, still had the notion of the divine, even if the divine is, um, well, actually, in most cases, polytheistic, right? Ancient Greeks, the Egyptians, early Hindus,
Mm-hmm.
but it is interesting that the notion of the divine did pop up in all those human groups.
Yeah, definitely.
Uh, so, yeah, this one was an interesting one, right?
Yeah.
Because it was like the one we actually are going to be talking about, you know, this week's reading. I feel like you can really get a handle on it. Presuppositionalism was, I feel like, slippery, and there
Mm-hmm.
was a question of whether or not we really got it, to be fair,
Mm-hmm.
and understood it. And I feel like this one has elements of that, you know,
Has elements of.
it has elements of it. It's not as it's like I get what he's saying, but in terms of it being like a really good forceful argument,
Mm-hmm.
right, or method, it's for me anyway. Yeah, it's tricky.
For
Anyone
the
who
Alvin
like
Plantinga's
yeah,
one?
yeah.
Okay, okay,
Like
cool.
I get the point, but if you actually think, I don't know, every now and then I think, okay, let's say I'm having a conversation with someone and I'm using this particular method. To what degree is it convincing? And maybe that's the word I'm looking for. I
Sure.
think
Yeah, yeah. Like there might be a
I might have
disconnect.
a sense of the divinity in myself. I might have had an experience, but then the other part of my mind is thinking of all these possible counters,
Mm-hmm.
as to why I'm plugging in God. And I think we talked about this, right? Could it be the case that let's say no God, but through the process of evolution, I have been, I have evolved to be a being that is in awe of things, right?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
I am small after all compared to the wonders of the world, right? And so, like being in the Grand Canyon, I could come up with another explanation as to why I'm feeling this sense,
Mm-hmm.
why do I have to? Why does that sense ultimately point to God? And I think that's valid.
Yeah.
That's a valid counter, and then you're sort of stuck, But for Plantinga, I think that um, you know the intuition, yeah, having that intuition is let's I don't know. Let's say I don't know. Maybe he would say the better explanation would be a god as opposed to sort of a natural phenomenon that ultimately brings a sense of awe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it's tricky if you're trying to compare that to like if you're having a discussion with somebody who doesn't have that point of view,
Yeah.
like you might be able to have the argument that you had where it's like, well, all these cultures and all these people believe in it, so there's some sort of weight to it,
Yeah.
to why people believe in the divine.
Mhm.
But that's not like personally convincing to a person. Like they might be like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, I understand why people believe that in general, or I understand why you might believe that it's an awareness or a sense, but they themselves just it's not like a purely rational um, thing.
Hmm. Precisely.
Hmm.
Precisely. You know.
Yeah,
Um, so yeah. But then he's also open for other arguments, right?
I think so.
Yeah. I thought he was
Oh, um,
um,
what kind of
yeah.
beliefs do you
Well,
mean,
you know
or
what?
arguments?
We can hold off on that
Yeah.
point. I would say that the most, just looking at my notes, the most uh, his major contribution is this notion of sensus divinitatis.
Hmm.
Uh, that's sort of biggest piece. Because it seemed like there was a lot of rejection in this chapter, from what I could tell,
Right.
right? classical foundationalism, um, and rejects evidentialism. Um, as self-defeating and unworkable, as the text says, and sort of pushes this notion that just as we have basic beliefs about reality, right? This was that whole chapter that dealt with we have a basic belief that that time didn't, the universe didn't just start 5 minutes ago,
Hmm.
and was created to look like it's aged. So it's a basic belief that we cannot fundamentally prove. Um, it is therefore possible that the belief that the sense of the divine is also properly basic.
Right.
Um, so, um, so yeah, good. So for sake of time,
Hmm.
we should probably push on. So we've got combinationalism in chapter 6. This is our actual uh, text for this week. E.J. Carnell, Gordon Lewis, and Francis Schaeffer, although very little was said about Francis Schaeffer. Um, the I thought this was a very interesting chapter, and maybe because of just the method seems, even if it's flawed, okay, the
Hmm.
method seems clearer. This is something I could communicate to somebody else, right? Um, and at least the method, and then we can analyze it and pick it apart.
Hmm.
But the basic notion here for this apologetic is to treat Christianity as a hypothesis, and then to test the hypothesis. So it sounds inductive and it sounds like the scientific method,
Hmm.
but it goes beyond sort of the scientific method in that it's not just dealing with uh, you know atoms in the void, right?
Right.
It's not just dealing with material. So so it couldn't just be looked at as like strict scientific method. Use it to prove Christianity, right?
Yeah. It's
But
beyond
it is
empiricism.
right, but it's similar in its approach,
Hmm.
but it's not right. It wouldn't fall within well, really either of the two camps of rationalism or empiricism.
Hmm.
Correct.
Yeah.
He even like toward the end of the chapter, they were like, it can't be. This can't be sort of a Lockean form of empiricism because Locke believed that the mind was a blank slate or a tabula rasa,
Hmm.
and then it is only through sense impressions that that blank slate of the mind starts to get built up. That notion is flawed because we're already born. I want to be careful here, but we have certain assumptions already that we're working with. The brain has material on it, as opposed to it being strictly blank.
Right.
Uh, so you can't, yeah. So at least the Lockean form of empiricism. Well, it can't be the Humean form either, because Hume was more radical with it. What I thought was interesting about this chapter too is I thought it was good how they were like looking at all the other sort of like possible hypotheses,
Hmm.
and like, and here's the flaw in this one, and here's the flaw in this one, and this is why this one, I thought that was interesting, right?
Mm, yeah. They just pointed them all
Sort
out.
of, and one of the examples they gave too, because in terms of a good hook or illustration of the method, was a police investigation into a murderer, right? I mean, all of the evidence is going to point toward one particular suspect as opposed to others. And in the same way, all of the sort of facts, as it were, or evidence in the world beyond just empirical evidence, right?
Hmm.
Because they even talked about sort of abstract notions of love and guilt and values, right? Justice, things like that, all sort of point to a particular suspect,
Hmm.
and in this case, Christianity. So the two thinkers were listed. It sounds like one followed the other, right? Or three
Uh,
thinkers.
there's three
E.J.
thinkers. Yeah.
Yeah, E.J.
E.J.
Carnell, but
Carnell
then
was
Gordon
primary
followed,
focus.
yeah, followed the same approach.
Yeah.
As it, uh,
Um.
I mean, just to give you a sort of a quote from the book, Carnell emphasized that Christianity, this is on page 149, is rationally acceptable because it is the most self consistent theory and fits all the relevant facts. Um,
Hmm.
this is going, and so this is going to be, we are outside of the realm of deduction here, which would give absolute certainty, right? Van Til would find this problem on a number of fronts. It's not, doesn't give certainty, and it tries to establish a point of contact with the universe. This would be problematic for Van Tillian forms of presuppositionalism.
Right.
Um, Yeah, and so I'm sorry. So it's not deductive. It's not even truly inductive, but it's this abductive,
Mm-hmm.
abductive, which in the text says begins with a theory and then checks the theory against the data. So I guess what's funny, even with to a degree with inductive reasoning, I feel like there is sort of still a working theory. Do you know? Or I should say, science's use of induction has got to have some working theory in the hypothesis, right? It's not that you just start noticing things happening in the world and then draw conclusions, right?
Mm-hmm.
You start noticing things happen in the world and then you develop a hypothesis and you test the hypothesis. I
Yep.
don't know. I feel like scientific reasoning. I mean, what is inductive reasoning? Is basically the notion of you are looking at um, you're looking at the world. Inductive reasoning is very much about the world, right? You're looking at the world, and then the more a thing repeats itself,
Mm-hmm.
the more you can say this is conclusive about it, right?
Yeah, you're looking for
I mean, I'm sorry,
patterns.
I'm putting it in such a bad way, but like the easier one would be, uh, all swans are white because each swan that I've seen is white, right? Except that argument broke down because they did discover a black swan. But just each time I see the swans, right?
Yeah.
You know, over and over again, I see this in the world. So you've got the accumulation of moments, and then you draw a conclusion from uh, that accumulation of moments. Now, I guess in that case, you don't really have a hypothesis, right? That in that case, you actually are just seeing things and then drawing a conclusion from it. Um, Science, though, I feel like no scientist is going around without a hypothesis, right? I mean,
Um.
maybe they'll bump
So
into certain things like black holes and be like, "Man, what's going on over here?" No, seriously,
yeah. Yeah.
what's going on over here? I don't know what's going on. I don't have a hypothesis,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And then have to just draw conclusions based on whatever abnormal activity
Yeah.
in outer
Usually,
space.
usually the scientific um, method, involves both induction and deduction. It's like a cycle, right? So
Hmm.
you could start on either side of the cycle with induction or deduction. So with
Yeah,
the inductive side of the cycle, if you are noticing a pattern, then you create a hypothesis or theory, right? Or I guess you create a
right.
hypothesis and then you test it, and then you're going from that hypothesis. You're making observations and then confirming or denying that hypothesis, and then you
Right.
kind of
Right.
cycle back with that hypothesis and modify it. But yeah, you can start on either end. So if there were a lot of things that were unknown, like even the concept of gravity was like, oh well, I that's a pattern that you observe, so you'd probably start with the inductive hypothesis, but that's not
Just
going to get
observation.
you. Yeah, just observing that things are falling. That's not going to get you to, oh, the
No,
moon is having
totally.
gravitational pulls with
You're
us.
absolutely right. You're
Um,
absolutely right. So yeah, I think you're right. So
yeah.
it's I would say probably advanced science, where we are right now in 2022, certainly is going to be more hypothesis laden
Hmm.
than early science because
Sure.
so much has been figured
Yeah,
out.
we figured out a
Uh,
lot. Yeah.
yeah.
Um,
So that means that the next, and I'm also thinking like real world science, where some foundation is going to fund scientific research. They're not, unless it's like that that Princeton uh, um, area of advanced study where they just throw, you're super
oh.
smart and they
Hmm.
throw money at you and they say do whatever you want, you know
Yeah.
abstract pure research. But I would say with other groups, they would most likely want to see what your track record was and what you're hoping to do
Hmm.
in order to get funding, which means you have probably a hypothesis, you have research, you have development already, you know.
And if you don't have a hypothesis, you might just have an end goal, and you might have to
Yeah.
experiment with hypotheses to get to that end goal, right?
Right. Right.
But yeah, I think one of the things about the combinationalism, now you called it abduction. I think, is this the same term, or are they using this as something different? The term systematic consistency came up. Um, I don't
They
think
have a nice definition on page 182. The
182.
property of a hypothesis by which it is self-consistent does not contradict itself and is consistent with all the relevant facts.
Aha.
So it's connected, both internal and external to us.
Yeah.
So it's yeah, it's an important piece of combinationalism,
Yeah.
and that
And
makes sense, right? Because well, there are. I'm sorry, there are. Um, Where's the nice little summary here? Um, because let's see. Oh, okay. So yeah, we have so-called tests in this process, right?
mhm.
Because we need to test the hypothesis. So what exactly are the tests? On page 176, Carnell first tests the hypothesis for self-consistency. Then he checks it with the relevant facts. Um, and let's see, yeah, and he finds Christianity to be the best view when tested rationally for consistency,
Mhm.
empirically for its fit with the facts, and existentially for its livability.
Mhm.
So, like I really appreciate the method. I think the method is very interesting, right? And I'm sure, obviously, well, there are criticisms of the method. I think the application of the method becomes really tricky
What do you mean?
because, well, so how do you? I mean, here's one. So I get the self consistency; totally makes sense, right?
Mhm.
But then he checks it with the relevant facts. I feel like that is uh, well, two, what are the relevant facts? One,
Mhm.
what are the relevant facts? And two, what what's involved with checking it? Um, because my thinking sort of went to um, so in terms of human reality, or in terms of reality, we have we'll just start real basic. I have things that are that I can investigate internally.
Mhm.
So um, my consciousness, my personality, so on and so forth, and also what happens in consciousness, like we had mentioned guilt before,
Mhm.
right, or joy or bliss. And then you have external to you, and when you get into external, I mean, you have the universe, you have the whatever, biology, chemistry, physics that covers the universe, right? That could be investigated. But then you have everything. Whatever, you have anthropology. I would just run through the college disciplines. You have anthropology, sociology, history. Um,
History is a big one, probably.
yeah, history would be a big one, and um, I don't know. You could go to international relations. You could go. So it's like it seems like a really large task,
Yeah.
and when you say when it comes down to what are the relevant facts as it connects to the theory, just a lot of question marks pop in my head.
Mhm.
So when you I guess I'm making 2 points. How do we determine relevant fact? One, and then two, what's the extent of the facts that need to be checked? Like
Oh,
where?
absolutely. I was having the same question because there was a point in this where was it? Where he was talking about there was about like commitment to beliefs, and
Mhm.
Carnell was um yeah, so on 159 I think was Carnell is more cautious. However, he raised a few reformed eyebrows with his suggestion that a genuine commitment to rational
Oh
principles
yeah,
entails that we must be willing to give up Christianity if it is shown to be
I like that.
untrue. And
Yeah.
and then on the next page, it said, perhaps we should view Carnell's position in light of Basil Mitchell's observation that rationality on any level, including the sciences, demands that we continue to hold our belief until, in the face of a certain amount of contrary evidence.
Hmm.
If we gave up our views at the first sign of trouble, we would never hold them long enough to verify or falsify them. So it's like, well, how long can you,
Principle of, yeah,
right?
the
Like, how
principle
long
of
can you hold
tenacity.
tenacity? Yes, principle of
Yeah,
tenacity. How long can you hold your beliefs then? All right, it's like,
yeah,
how long are you going to go? How long is any point of view going to go back and forth and argue about a
right.
fact of reality
Yeah,
before they give up? I don't know. It's like
yeah,
it's kind of the same question as what you're asking. It's like,
yeah.
what extent do you go
Sure.
out for the relevant facts, and
Well,
then how
what?
long do you take your
Yeah.
point?
Why don't we play it out?
Hmm.
Possible world, right?
Okay.
I mean, let's play it out. What would like? What would be? Let's actually see um like what would be some facts. So we'll play the role of these guys, right?
Okay.
What would be the facts that we would bring in, and then how would those facts ultimately support Christianity as a true hypothesis?
Hmm.
So I would say, for instance, I mean, there might be some like sort of easy things in terms of creation,
Sure.
right? That the whatever, that there is a universe, that it is very complex,
Hmm.
that possibly it seems absurd that it would occur out of just simply an accident.
Hmm.
By the way, I would imagine you could even include Big Bang cosmology here,
Sure.
even with the God notion. There's
Hmm.
nothing there that's inconsistent, right? God
Yep.
create in any particular way. So, but the idea that it just literally comes from nothing for no reason, and you have this level of complexity, seems that there should be an author,
Yeah,
right?
I think. I mean, I think when you go about trying to figure out which facts to consider, you're going to kind of have like a spectrum, right? There's going to be you can kind of divide it in the middle. There's going to be all of the facts that are mentioned in the
Mm-hmm.
worldview, then there's going to be the
Mm-hmm.
facts that aren't mentioned in the worldview, like my personal existence, my name, like literal facts about right now, aren't
Totally.
mentioned in
I
the
got you.
worldview, right? And then you're
Totally
going to
got you.
have one, so we can pretty much exclude all things that aren't mentioned in the worldview because they're not going to have contact, they're not going to
Right.
do anything
That
about
is
it.
a good way to distinguish relevant.
So then you've got all the ones that are directly mentioned, or maybe you'll have ones probably in the middle that are kind of indirectly relevant, right? So you're mentioning some directly relevant ones like creation
Totally.
and the origins of the universe, but there might be some indirectly relevant ones. I don't know if I can come up with an example, but maybe an indirect relevant one might be some sort of explanation for another worldview that worldview is in conflict with the Christian one.
Right. Right.
Or I don't know. There's probably better examples. But I
Maybe.
think we've kind of
Yeah.
got
Yeah.
those
Yeah.
three categories, and you
Oh, no, I
definitely want
got
to
you. Well,
focus
maybe
on
an
the ones that are in
indirect one
contact.
would be, maybe an indirect one would be a flaw of other hypotheses.
Okay, what do you mean?
Meaning, in other words, if other hypotheses are flawed, and this one is showing more consistency and relevance to the facts, that is, by seeing the flawed hypotheses, because they don't account for X,
Okay.
leads uh, leads the individual to see the that
Oh,
this
okay.
see this hypothesis as being true.
Interesting. Yeah, yeah.
It's
So
I went meta there.
a little bit, yeah.
But
So in
yeah,
like actual facts that discount other hypotheses, right? But don't
yeah,
necessarily have a concrete thing towards or against Christianity, right?
yeah, yeah,
That's kind of what you're saying would be an indirect thing.
yeah.
It's like, oh, it definitely
Awesome.
makes that
Yeah,
makes some it makes some worldviews completely irrelevant. This
right,
fact,
right,
but it
right.
doesn't really touch Christianity, so it kind of turns the tables towards
Yeah.
Christianity, I suppose.
Now, so the thing though that I have, so you've got like, so we have creation as one, right?
Hmm.
We have the creation of our, we as creatures, right? Then is another one, and of course, I mean, we're skipping a lot here, but creation is a big one. Within creation, we can then throw, are there any relevant facts related to biology,
Hmm.
chemistry, physics that help point to that? I'm betting there's a lot that is irrelevant.
Sure.
Um, right. Like I don't know. I see physics. I was gonna say like quarks, but then again, when you get into subatomic physics, then it becomes very interesting in terms of its complexity and its workings, and that complexity can point to, once again, a complex creator.
Yeah. So I mean,
And
that would might be an example of an indirect fact. Like
yeah,
you're getting down into the complexities, and that supports
yeah,
um, the creator notion because you can't.
right,
Well, it depends, I suppose. If I guess if we're coming from this combinationalist point of view, then we're not going to have the direct sense of the divine. So we
yeah,
have to get there a different way, right?
yeah,
So
yeah,
maybe that would be relevant.
yeah.
You can't just be like, oh, well, that's an indirect support.
Then I'm also thinking about things like, um, so as creatures, we have, as I started out, internal and external facts. Okay, so and
Yeah.
the one of like guilt was brought up, and that's a really interesting one, right?
Hmm.
Guilt, or um, a sense of, I don't know. I was going to say ennui, but sort of all of those sort of traits. Now, the the thing that I'm aiming at here is that when you deal with things like guilt, um, and obviously, guilt can play into the Christian notion of fallenness and sin
Hmm.
compared to an all good God, right? Compared to perfection. But then I'm also thinking, like, what about Judaism as a hypothesis,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
Because within Judaism, and you find this in the Old Testament as well, the there you still have the notion of sin and guilt, right? As a piece. Now, I mean, possibly you could come back and say, yeah, but what about you don't have the rest of the story,
Hmm.
you need the New Testament, you need the gospel ultimately to give a full account
Right.
of guilt before a sinless, perfect God, right? Um,
Couldn't
the
you
so
also, I don't know, I mean, I'm not familiar with the religion, but couldn't you also with like Taoism, like say that, guilt comes from an imbalance in chaos and order? Like it's the imbalance, it's not
that's
necessarily
where I'm
good or
going.
wrong. Yeah?
Yeah, that's sort of where I'm going in terms of, um, like, I mean, these world religions would not be around if at some level they don't satisfy needs,
Yeah.
right? Not just cultural needs of stability.
Hmm.
Um, Everyone's in their place and whatever. We celebrate the holidays and it makes us happy. I think that at some level it connects to individuals, and speaks to them in certain ways. So, like, I was even thinking too, like with Buddhism. Buddhism is really interesting in terms of, sort of what is the fundamental problem of human life. Now, obviously, within the Christian story, it's going to be creation, fall, redemption, right? And then the problem is the fall, and being fallen and
Hmm.
original sin, struggling with sin, and the need for a redeemer. But within Buddhism, very stripped down. Um, the the essential problem is desire. So, in
Hmm.
other words, like, we'll read this when we go through our sort of world religions readings. But Siddhartha, who then became the Buddha, was struggling with sickness, death, um, and there was one other. Um, and like, why is this in the world? Why is this in the world? He meditates under the Bodhi tree, and then it strikes him in a moment of enlightenment that it's ultimately desire is the problem. That people desire way too much life, way too much health. In fact, we desire a lot of things way too much.
Hmm.
And that to solve this problem, we need to relinquish desire. And when you relinquish desire, that's ultimately the cure, right, for the human condition. I mean, that could play, I mean, you know, like that could easily play as a hypothesis into the, if there is a fundamental problem,
Hmm.
you know, with the human condition, I feel like your Taoist example could play, you know,
Yeah.
and so, like, to what degree then? I mean, even for these guys in this theory, like, I mean, did you sit down and actually work through Taoism? Did you sit down and work through Judaism? Did you sit down and work through, you know, uh, uh, Muslim theology and compare the facts? You know,
Right. Well, it's complicated because it's like, well, okay, I've got my religion and I'm starting to compare these other ones. Anybody could slide a document that has a religion on it towards you or way, and that's a lot of work to compare. So it's like
totally.
I don't know. In that sense, the self-consistency is, I guess, the safer route because you
Right.
don't need to worry about all the other options.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I guess I feel like there would be some.
No, you're right. I mean, you could start with, I mean, but the problem is, I mean, these guys were already Christians. You know what I'm saying?
No,
So
yeah,
you could
absolutely.
you're starting with that one.
Yeah.
Um, and I agree, because I mean, if someone wanted to come up with the absurd proposal of, okay, fine, then take every possible hypothesis. Now let's say worldview hypothesis,
Hmm.
not, you know, little hypotheses.
Yeah.
Every worldview hypothesis, and run it through the system. Then, I mean, one, it'll be an impossible task, right?
Hmm.
You'd have to go through all these different cults, you
Yeah.
know, unless you can do a summary,
Sure, you can
like,
categorize them.
you can categorize them and
Right.
then dismiss the category based on X, Y, and Z.
Right.
So maybe it's like, monotheism versus polytheism, and you could
Right.
do some
So
more.
yeah, if you can categorize a bunch of, or I guess that's a good example, monotheism versus polytheism. If you can prove one or the other, then you can discount the entire category, right?
Correct.
Or if you
Correct.
can categorize a bunch of things based off of one premise that they have that you can disprove, then you can disqualify the entire category. There's one other thing about guilt. I believe that it was guilt. I can't remember if it was like a different emotion, but there are people. There are very few, but there are people who don't experience that emotion. I think it
That's interesting.
was guilt. It was either guilt or
Yeah.
sadness,
Sure. Sure.
and it was just something different in their physiology, their
Yeah.
brain chemistry, and they just weren't unable to experience it. So it's like I don't know. How do you account for weird things
You
like
would
that?
probably, I would imagine the response from a lot of people and or these apologists would be, they're outliers.
Yeah.
The dominant experience among most human beings for most of history has been a sense of guilt.
Hmm. So I don't know, but yeah. How,
I mean,
for
I
that no, but for
agree.
that individual person, like, how do you analyze them? Like,
Yeah,
they don't experience guilt. Is there no sin there? Like,
yeah.
I don't know. From their point of view,
Yeah,
it might
I
seem
would
that
say
way.
for that, for that individual person, that would probably. I mean, I don't know. I can imagine some people saying that it's sort of an abnormality,
I mean, yeah,
and
that
they're,
makes sense from an external point of
yeah,
view, but from
yeah.
their personal
Oh, from their
experience of the
own. Oh
world, right?
gosh, yeah.
Like, I don't know. It's
I
yeah,
don't even
that's
know.
another weird thing. Is like, how do you?
I wouldn't even know what the experience would be like. I
Yeah.
couldn't. You know, I've
Hmm.
done so much wrong in my life, and I'd have so much guilt about it. You know what I'm saying? No, I have no idea how they would experience
Yeah.
uh, non-guilt.
Hmm.
I think what I'm getting at, to go back, is what is it, about the Christian hypothesis that gives the best explanation to the facts versus other possible, um, let's say, religious worldviews?
Hmm.
Because I think that makes it harder.
Yeah, because
Makes it hard.
they have more boxes to check, and they have more people following them. Because if you have other
Exactly.
worldviews, they're usually more self-contained and maybe could fall within others.
Yeah, but also too, like, I think that a strict form of materialism is really flawed. It's reductionistic,
What do you
reducing
mean?
us all. a strict form of materialism. In other words, like everything is matter in motion. It's just the atoms in
No,
the
what do you mean
void.
that it's flawed though? Like,
Well, if that, well, it's flawed in the sense that it ultimately is dismissing anything that exists that's non-material.
right,
And the
okay.
and the problem I have with that is that I think there's a lot of experiences or facts in the world, as it were, that lead to, like, consciousness being one of them,
Mm-hmm.
right? You know, I understand that a strict materialist would say that our consciousness is basically a epiphenomena, but that's even interesting. But an epiphenomena of ultimately our synapses firing, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's not how we experience consciousness.
Right.
That's consciousness to me it seems much more of an immaterial event or experience than simply reducing it down to um, synapses firing
Right.
and brain stuff.
Yeah, so it's like materialism, I mean, is definitely like we
And just to be clear, materialism is cutting off the immaterial,
yeah, mm-hmm.
as it like okay.
It's useful, right, for analyzing the
Oh,
material. But
totally. No,
yeah,
no, no, no,
but it's
no.
flawed in this
Material.
specific regard.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
No, no, no. I'm not dismissing
Yeah, yeah. No, no,
materialism
yeah. Just wanted to clarify.
as let's say a method for scientific investigation,
Yeah.
but as a full total worldview,
Yeah.
I'm much more comfortable saying I think it's too reductionistic. It doesn't fully explain experiences like love, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
right? My experience of love is not chemical cocktail in my head at all.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's connected to it, but my experience of love is something far more complex than simply serotonin.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd be more comfortable criticizing that as a total worldview. But I am lost as what to do with Taoism, Hinduism, Islam.
Because they bring
Uh,
in aspects that are immaterial, it's harder to
yeah,
judge, I guess.
yeah, and also too, like, what is it? Why what creation, fall, redemption? Okay, and I know I'm being brief on Christianity there, but creation, fall, redemption. Well, so the problem then is sin. Um, and I totally could see that. Like if you play that hypothesis out
Mm-hmm.
entirely, pride, you run through all the lust, so on and so forth, and and you can point to crime on the streets, and you can point to the war in Ukraine, and you can point to abuses of all sorts of kind. Fine, but then why not another? Your Taoism example. That ultimately, why aren't those things the result of an imbalance
Mm-hmm.
of the yin and the yang,
Mm-hmm.
um, or why, or
Or
the
desire,
Buddhist
like you're saying. Yep.
desire of and part of the Buddhist notion is ultimately to overcome ego,
Mm-hmm.
and um, you know, I mean, they did say at one point, I
There was
think it was
something so
10,
interesting about ego.
remember,
Yeah.
but it wasn't about ego in particular, but there was
No,
one thing
oh,
where
there
they,
was though. I don't know. On 164, it was this was I think this is a quote of Carnell. This he saw as Christ's way. When offering the gospel, therefore, Christ appeals to the ego. He promises men that by giving up one type of
oh,
selfishness before men, they will gain a new and higher selfishness before God. If we follow
yeah,
him, we receive peace in heart and treasures in heaven. All of this appeals to self-love. I thought that was
yeah.
interesting. I've never heard that.
Very interesting. No, that was very interesting. What do you get higher selfishness before God?
What?
Understand that phrase?
Higher selfish. It's like I don't know. I think what I get out of this is like selfishness before men is like it's very in the world, very material selfishness, just like something that you
I got,
have now, and it's
I
in
got.
the context of your lifespan. But this higher
In other
selfishness
words,
sounds like it goes beyond life in the context of Christianity.
yeah, yeah. In other words, I like if I am interested in my existence after death,
Yeah,
I have a stake in that. In that I am being somewhat selfish.
yeah, and I don't know. I don't know. There's something in that that seems like a conflict of interest to me. But it's interesting to think about at least.
Oh, here we go. 172.
Mm-hmm.
This will help us a little bit. This was toward the end.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the end of that section before Francis Schaeffer, and it um, I think it warrants a relatively full reading. But Lewis gives brief examples of how other views are inadequate. David Hume's empiricism, for example, could not affirm the existence of the self, which led to the loss of inner dignity and responsibility. By the way, his hardcore empiricism. So David Hume had the notion that I only know what I sense.
Mm.
And he was strict with that. You don't actually sense the self.
Interesting. Okay.
What you do when you introspect is you only ever sense earlier sensations,
Mm-hmm.
what I've eaten, what I've done, so on and so forth. So if you are anything, you're a bundle of your sensations.
Okay.
But that's not really a self in a traditional sense.
Mm-hmm.
And then he goes on. Secular humanism sought to restore human worth, but destroyed the self-determining personal agent who was to have dominion over his environment rather than be determined by it. Um, I just hit some of these because it's the religion one that I'm interested in. Existentialists addressed empiricism's loss of the self by giving priority to the individual, affirming that there are no constraints on freedom because there is no God, and no constraints on an individual's nature. Uh, Sartre says existence precedes essence. Each thing is an individual and not determined by a category of which it is a part. And then Lewis goes on. His response says this entails no essences can be known. The broader implication for Sartre is that there can be no objectively valid statements about anything. So, well, even including Sartre's own statements, which obviously is always a clever way of defeating somebody. But and then two major forms of Eastern thought are self-contradictory. So this would be a self-contradictory element. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Hinduism affirms that Brahma is ultimate reality, so God is everything.
Mm-hmm.
It is also said that no true statements can be said about it or be made about it.
Oh, interesting.
So it contradicts itself in that statement. Brahma is ultimate reality. No true statements can be made about it. And then on other forms, on some forms of Buddhism, things themselves cannot be known. Yet Buddhist writer Alan Watts, who I read a lot of years ago, has published many books on unspeakable experience. Now that's the Zen form of Buddhism, where uh, yeah, that's not all forms of Buddhism. And then yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so I mean, you know, I don't know. I almost feel like the rules of like what are the rules? I mean, I understand like what self consistency means, but I mean, I don't know. Look at the Trinity.
Yeah.
To what degree is that? Where's the consistency in a being that is three and one? I mean, I'm not knocking it. I actually
Yeah.
quite like the idea of the Trinity. But or the doctrine from the creed that Jesus is 100% man and 100% divine.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, do you and then we're back to the issue. If you like, do we have like a faith bucket that we just throw some things into that don't make sense to us? Um, what we believe in on faith? I don't know. Wait a minute. You said it had to be self-consistent,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and maybe I'm missing something. Maybe there is a certain you know uh, self-consistency in what doesn't seem consistent, or I'm sorry, what seems contradictory.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't know, that last point, the faith bucket could probably put under the category of the, what was it, the tenacity? Um was that what it was called? Something tenacity or just tenacity?
Yeah, the principle of tenacity.
Yeah, the principle of tenacity.
Well, that would be like you hold on to the belief, right? You hold on to the belief,
Hold on to the belief,
fight.
set that thing aside because you don't understand it well enough, right?
Yeah,
It could be your reason. Um so you put it off to the side. Now, do you
right.
investigate it? I don't know. That's a good question.
Yeah.
But
I
yeah.
mean, you have. I mean, in both of those examples, Jesus 100% man and 100% God. I mean, that that is a contradiction. That
It
a
if
being can
you
be three and one is a contradiction.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
not saying that it can't exist. Maybe those things can exist,
Hmm.
but at least in terms of how we understand them and how sort of, you know, basic rules of, consistency and non-contradiction work, you know,
Yeah, I mean, I guess like, I guess there's a couple things. Like, are you one analyzing it from a purely logical point of view? Like, how are you analyzing the words? Are you like, okay, well,
right,
100% and 100%? It's like, well, duh, nothing can be two 100%s, right? Although you could
right,
have like, my
right.
glass
Well,
of
no, it's saying
water is
it's essentially saying
100%.
that it's 100% this and it's 100% not this.
Well, yes, but like, my glass of water, here I have one, is
Right?
the part that contains water, right, is 100% H2O. It's also 100% atoms that have hydrogen and 100% atoms that have oxygen, or
Okay,
molecules, sorry, that
okay,
have,
okay, okay,
right?
okay.
So it's a question of like composition, right? So
How I'm dividing it up, how I'm
yeah,
cutting it up.
yeah, like
Right.
if I don't know, if you believe that bodies have souls attached to them, right? And that Jesus' soul was God's soul, essentially, right?
Mhm.
Then he is 100% man in that he has all the same physical attributes as all other people, but his soul is the same soul as God's, not
Yeah.
as the random little souls that we have, I
Or, yeah.
suppose.
Essence. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
So the
Totally.
composition, and then the Trinity. Well, I mean that's a different. I guess it's a different issue. Like, but I don't know. One
Well,
thing that.
the other thing I was thinking
Mhm.
was if remember what he said too. So now I'm playing his side, right?
Okay.
Remember what they said is that you it's going to be the best explanation.
Right.
It's not going to be the most perfect,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
The best explanation, and that means even within the explanation itself, there might be pieces that we can't get our heads
Mm-hmm.
around that don't hold as much weight as as other pieces, creation, fall, redemption,
Mm-hmm.
something like that. So yes, is the doctrine of the Trinity important? Are the two natures of Jesus important? Totally. But the fact that there might be some inconsistency with them probably is their response, or I'm guessing their response, would not crush the system.
Right. It doesn't
You know?
disprove.
Right. But one now, let's be fair to the other hypotheses. He was very brief with Hinduism and Buddhism.
Oh
Okay,
yeah, yeah.
but I mean, very right,
Especially, I'm
and
sorry, I have to say, especially the Brahman is ultimate reality. Yet it can also be said that no true statements can be made about it. Well, it's like, well, what if you can't have those two things together? It's like this is the only statement that you can make about reality is that you can't make other statements about it. I don't know.
right,
Like,
right. No, you could sort of tag it on,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So,
Or rather,
or is the
Brahman is
issue?
ultimate reality is just a name for reality, but you can't make true statements about it. It's like
Yeah,
that's just what we call it. Right? There's nothing wrong with naming something. So I call ultimate reality Brahman, but it can't
right.
be a true statement because there can't be true statements. I just call it that. I don't know. I
Mhm.
don't know the religion
But
well enough
also
to make that.
too, it seems like I mean, I don't think that you can just. I mean, if I mean, I mean, they're going big,
Yeah.
right? With ultimate reality, and then the major contradiction that no true statements can be made about it. But I just made a statement.
Right.
But there's so much more with. But it seems like you can, unless they're like cutting at the root, right?
Hmm.
It seems like the are yeah, okay. It's like does that entirely cut off, let's say, Hinduism, or is that yeah? Is there something wrong, like you were pointing out?
Hmm.
Um, but as we go back to Christianity, what's I don't know when we have sort of those inconsistencies. Is it just that they don't hold a lot of weight, whereas dang it, this one does, right? Right? Because
Right.
I made a statement about something that I can't make a statement about.
Hmm.
Um, and
Like
you
Trinity
know,
not appearing in the Bible,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
It's not. It
cool.
the weight isn't there as much.
Yeah, yeah. So I don't know. I guess what I'm getting at is like criteria. Like,
Mm-hmm.
what are the criteria when you start when you start um, testing the hypothesis?
Yeah.
That's that's I feel like the criteria are just not clear. I mean, it's got to be consistent, and then the facts need to what support it. The facts need to fit, you know,
Yeah.
with the
Mm-hmm.
hypothesis. That part to me, I feel like I get it in terms of what it's saying,
Yeah.
but in terms of application for the one you're supporting and for the ones you're defeating, I think it needs far more clarification. Now, granted, these were summaries, and maybe we
Yeah.
need to crack out one of these authors' books to figure out, if they actually did this type of investigating. Because I feel like to dismiss an entire world religion in a sentence is problematic.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I think either I mean maybe they've defined more detailed processes, or if they haven't, then I feel like if you're going to go about that route of analyzing these worldviews, then you need to come up with a system or a process. Like, okay,
Yeah,
we take all of the statements of the religion, right? Those should be things that you can iterate over, right? So you can check them off for consistency, right? And then all of those things that are supposed to be consistent with the facts of the world, then you need to apply the facts of the world, the most relevant facts of the world, which you determined are ones that directly contact those consistent ones, and maybe some
right.
indirect ones that come up along the way. Um, and then I don't know. Do you come up with a probability like, okay, 95% of our statements fit with the facts? And then you look
Right.
at the other one, another religion. It's like, oh well, only 50% of their statements support the
Yeah.
facts. So I don't. You maybe it's just a comparison method that way because it is a probability based system,
It is.
right?
Nope, you're right.
You can't get to complete certainty with the system. Like
You won't.
I think at the beginning of the chapter it mentioned, well, you can't really get to complete certainty that Abraham Lincoln was an actual person who walked
Sure.
about the earth because you can only look at what you have right in front of you from like a
Right.
purely materialist point of view.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's probability based, and I feel like if you're gonna go that route, you have to kind of define some
Yeah.
criteria before you actually analyze it.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I think, in conclusion, this was a really interesting one. And I
Mm-hmm.
think part of it is that at some level, it makes sense as a method.
Mm-hmm.
At some level, it does make sense. We apply it in other aspects of our lives, either personally, and it's certainly applied in the sciences, right? It totally makes sense. And also, I, I feel like this, as we can tell by our conversation, it really lends itself to analysis,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Whereas the presuppositionalist, and to a degree, though we liked Plantinga's sense of the divine, uh, it's just I'm more, especially the presuppositionalist. I'm just more perplexed and can't
Yeah.
really. It's
Where do you start?
yeah, I'm more perplexed and I'm stuck with not being able to really advance in analysis.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for the the ability to sort of mull this one over because
Yeah.
it was fun.
Mm-hmm.
It was sort of like there's just it's such a cool theory that has a lot of pros and cons that you can pick away at.
Mm-hmm.
So good.
Yeah.
On
Good.
to on to the next thing.
On to the next thing. All right. I will stop the recording.